Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Allan. Have you seen any video footage coming out of certain cities in Australia lately? And I'm going to stop you right there if you think this is something I'm referring to, like a warm and fuzzy images of kangaroos or koala bears. That's not what I'm talking about. This video footage is quite the opposite of that. Take a look.
Hey!
Police public order warning. You have previously been directed to leave. Leave now or force may be used.
Throw at the coppers, look at that! Look at that, they're throwing at the coppers! Get him! Whoa!
What you saw there are the streets of Melbourne, Australia, which is in the midst of a severe lockdown. It's 6th to date. Melbourne can now claim the title as the world's most locked-down city. Restrictions to Aussie freedom in some cities include no traveling outside of a certain kilometrage of your residence. It was recently increased, for example, to 15 kilometers in Melbourne. Curfew is still in place, meaning no going out from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. You're not permitted any visitors to your home. The construction industry is shut down. Only essential stores could be open. You can't even have a wedding in some cities. And what happens to the state borders? Well, most of them are shut down. So if you were stuck outside of your state and you needed to apply for a permit to return home. And to be clear, most of the other major cities in Australia faced similar lockdown measures as well. But what has caught most of us by surprise are the images of police presence and in some cases, police violence against protesters in the streets. Police are full in riot gear, using rubber bullets, batons, and shields. And for context, Australia has experienced about 1,500 COVID deaths in a country with a population of 25.7 million. Canada, for example, is tracking 28,000 COVID deaths, and we have 38 million. In recent days, some cities and states have started to ease the lockdown restrictions, but questions remain. How did this happen in Australia? Isn't Australia the country of strong and bold patriotism, assertiveness? How did the lockdown get so bad in parts of the country? Well, joining me now to help us understand is James Allan, Chair in Law at the University of Queensland in Australia, writer with The Spectator Australia and The Australian, and a native Canadian himself. Mr. Allan, thank you so much for joining me today to help us unpack of what's going on in Australia.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for having me on.
So I think we'll just start in a general, what is the current state of lockdown in Australia?
So as with Canada and the States, it goes state by state, so province by province. They're called states here. I live in Queensland, which has had pretty much the lightest. So we've been lucky. I should tell your listeners, I'm a lockdown skeptic. I've been on the side of Sweden since day one. What you hardly ever hear in the media is that as of November 2019, the WHO and all of the accumulated 100 years worth of scientific evidence was against lockdowns, against masks, treat the people who are vulnerable. And that got thrown out the window in the course of 2.5 months in 2020. And no one has ever explained what new evidence we have to justify getting rid of 110 years worth of accumulated evidence. Sweden stuck with the original 2019 plan, and people don't talk about Sweden anymore because they're doing so well. 14,000 and change deaths. They never locked down. They never closed the business. They put some restrictions on big gatherings. Maybe 500 was a limit.
Wow.
Their epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell, and he's already saying, look, we got it right. And he said, I just copied the British plan, which the Brits threw out because Boris didn't have a backbone. It's hard not to look at Sweden and say, because what you don't hear in the media is this is not a disease that hits everyone equally. So this is the latest Stanford data. This is for unvaccinated people. If you're under 20, your survival rate, if you get it, is 99.997%. If you're under 20 to 29, it's 99.986. 30 to 39, 99.969. It doesn't drop below 99.7 until you get to the over 70s. And in every country, as far as I know, the median age of COVID death is higher than the expected life expectancy. This is a disease that hits the elderly, so we should be protecting them. And the second worst thing you can be is morbidly obese.
We'll be right back in a few moments. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the draconian measures implemented in Australia. And joining me is James Allan, Canadian, but working at the University of Queensland in Australia. Thank you so much for joining me again, James. You painted a very interesting picture of what the data presents globally and in most countries in the world. And, when I think of Canada and we look at other, G7 nations, we look at Australia as kind of being our counterpart. And while we've had some very restrictive, severe measures in Canada, it seems Australia is just on a whole different level. Could you explain what went down and when did these really severe restrictive measures start?
Yes, well, again, it's state by state, and Australia is an island, and the call they got right early on was closing the international borders to China. But the problem with that was we basically had very few deaths. And, bending the curve became an implicit COVID zero policy. And Victoria has a particularly hardline premier who, basically has turned the police into a force against anyone who is protesting against the world's longest lockdowns. Now, I should tell readers, I grew up in a sort of Scarborough, Toronto middle-class family. If there's any law professor in the world who is more pro-police than me, I don't know who it is. But I have been sickened by some of the things the Victorian police have done. There are videos of them walking up behind protesters who are just standing there and hurling them to the ground as though they were going to break their heads. They've been handcuffing pregnant women in their homes because they're trying to organize protests. There are video, and this doesn't make the mainstream media. The equivalent of the CBC, the ABC, is painting a picture as if everyone protesting is some rabidly insane anti-vaxxer, when that's a small segment. They definitely come out to the protests. But these are mostly people who have lost their livelihoods. I mean, when you realize that lockdowns do not hurt people in the public sector, they don't hurt any of the politicians, they don't hurt people in big business. They wipe out entrepreneurs, they wipe out small business class, and they're very hard on the young. And these people have had enough after we're now, Melbourne's now the longest lockdown jurisdiction in the world, and they still have some of the highest case totals in Australia. So the state of Victoria is doing the worst. And of course, half the deaths have occurred in old age facilities, which is true in, more or less 40-60% in most countries. So there's a lot of anger in Victoria. It hasn't happened here in Queensland because we really haven't been locked down very much.
And again, I find the numbers are shocking. And I mean, I guess to Australia's credit, the numbers of COVID death is very low. I was shocked to see the number compared to Canada, for example, where we have a much higher death rate. And I'm not suggesting that, anyways, my point is for the extreme measures for such a low death rate, I was surprised.
Well, yes, but again, people forget that I'm sort of with Lord Sumption here. He's the retired top UK Supreme Court judge who said these lockdowns around the world have been the worst inroads on our civil liberties and freedoms ever. And if you make COVID deaths the only matrix of concern, Australia looks pretty good.
Right.
But the lockdowns themselves cause deaths. There are missed cancer checks. There's mental health checks. Some children's lives are basically ruined. They'll never catch up. Being educated by Zoom for 2 years is worthless. I see it at the universities. And what we're seeing now is that the one measure you can't game is overall deaths. Like you can't, you can game COVID. You can say someone who had COVID and got hit by a bus was a COVID death. And that's what they do in the UK, by the way. So you can't game the deaths. And if you look at overall deaths, Australia is not doing very well. COVID deaths, great. So there's a problem here. And the problem is what if you can't just make COVID deaths your only matrix of concern, you have to look at all the other deaths. You have to look at freedom issues. You have to look at people having employment issues. We have a supposedly conservative government nationally. And in terms of support for people because of COVID, we have outspent Justin Trudeau by about double. Now, and I'm a right of center law prof. So I'm like, there's only about 4 of us in the world. We can't travel on the same plane together. But when you're outspending Justin Trudeau per capita massively, you are the problem. You are the big spending problem. And so even the Conservative government here in Australia, to my view, is a very big problem.
Wow.
And they have locked themselves into this approach or narrative where they are going to keep COVID deaths down. Doesn't matter what the ancillary effects are. It's crazy.
Right.
So I just think Australia's handled it terribly.
Well, we're going to pick this up because we have to run to commercial break in just a moment. But, New Zealand also had COVID zero as their aim, but they just recently opened up the borders. I want to hear your perspective on that in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the COVID lockdowns and draconian measures in Australia. And joining me is Professor James Allan, chair in law at the University of Queensland in Australia, and actually a fellow Canadian himself. Professor Allan, you said that Australia sought out from the very get-go a zero COVID policy, which to me seems completely ridiculous and unrealistic. But whatever, that was the policy they seemed to seek out. New Zealand sought out a similar policy, but they've now said, you know what, we've had enough, no more lockdowns. We're opening things up. Could we have the same hope for Australia?
Okay, so two brief things. My wife and I have lived here for 16 years, but I lived in 11 years in New Zealand before that. So firstly, no one started out on zero COVID. It morphed into that after they started with bending the curve. So New Zealand recently, if anyone has been worse than Australia, it's New Zealand. Auckland's had a lockdown now for 2 cases or something for ages. It jumped up to 32. And their Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, about a week and a half ago said, zero COVID's not going to work. We have to open up. And then about 3 days later, she imposed an indefinite lockdown on Auckland. So, New Zealand is worthless. They are just crazy. They and Victoria are the world's most diluted sort of jurisdictions. The virus is endemic. And so what a lockdown does is it keeps it out, but at the cost of no employment. And then as soon as you open up the lockdown, cases go back up. My wife and I are double vaccinated, partly because we're coming back to Canada to see the kids who are in London and see my mom. But what the vaccine does is it stops you from dying. There's plenty of evidence coming out of Israel and Britain now that vaccinated people transmit the disease almost as much as unvaccinated.
Yes, I've seen those studies.
Yes. And so when people say, so I don't personally care if I'm in the presence of an unvaccinated. People who think unvaccinated people are a problem haven't been reading the data. If you're vaccinated, you're fine. So all these vaccine mandates are crazy in my view. All they do is make you feel good about yourself.
Okay, but sorry, go ahead.
So I'm sort of with the people who say, look, it's up to you whether you want to get vaccinated. If you're over 60, you'd be crazy not to get vaccinated. If you're under 60, the odds of dying from the disease are tiny.
Okay, but in Australia, some of the most, and they're, anti-lockdown or freedom protests, whatever you like to call them, happening in all jurisdictions. But some of the most vocal protests against the government lockdowns that I've seen has been from Australia. The footage that I've seen from Australia.
Yeah, but Tanya, imagine you've been locked in your house for 300 days and can't go out, and these people are angry. And I would say the opposite. I would say most Australians have been incredibly compliant.
Well, this is what I was after. So, I've known, we all have this image of Australians as these freedom fighters and these very patriotic, brave citizens. I was surprised that there was such compliance with such extreme measures in cities like Melbourne, in that state. And what has taken Australians maybe so long, or is there really that much fear of the virus?
Well, I think there's 2 things. Firstly, most of the press, and I don't want to be too disparaging here, but most of the press has sort of acted like a part of a fear porn outfit. When they do surveys asking people what they think their chances of dying are if they get it, there's a big chunk of people who pick 30%. In fact, it's about 0.3, and that's just lumping everyone together. If you're under 50, it's negligible. And so we were in Britain last Christmas, and the daily onslaught. So in Australia, every day the premier is fronting the press, telling you how many cases there were.
Right.
Cases. This is ridiculous. And so in that sense, I think people have been scared witless. People aren't very good with risk analysis. And I think, well, the other problem you might mention is the one that the famous Australian writer, Clive James, he ended up spending most of his life in London. He said, Australians think they're descended from convicts, but they're actually descended from prison warders. And that sort of is the view. Like, people are so compliant here. I'm not a Texan sort of Floridian. I'm a Canadian, but I would be out protesting if I were in Victoria. If you're locking me up for 250 days for a disease that only kills people statistically in their 80s, like, by all means, let's treat people in old age homes. Let's be really careful. But young people are having their lives completely ruined.
And that's what I've noticed at the protests. A lot of the people protesting, they're young people. We only have 20 seconds, so we will pick this up after the break. But, you know, the age, the demographic looks very young, very active, a lot of immigrants, a lot of people are upset. And again, as you said, you've been locked up for 250 plus days. Why wouldn't you be upset? All right, we're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on what's going on in Australia in the context of COVID, with these extreme lockdowns going on 250 plus days in certain jurisdictions. Joining me is Professor James Allan. Professor Allan, you know, in Canada, I know we have various civil liberty stakeholder groups who are advocating and challenging things in the courts. What is going on in Australia with respect to civil liberties advocates?
So, I mean, I'm a bit of a refugee from the Canadian Charter of Rights. I've never liked it since 1982. I feel that, you know, these powerful bills of rights just effectively, when you buy one, you're buying the views of the judicial caste. And so they're making calls on things that really should be made democratically. Here was a test, though. Given that these were the worst inroads on our civil liberties, maybe the judicial caste would step up against heavy-handed government. Hasn't happened anywhere in the world. I predicted it wouldn't happen. You know, if you go to court and you want a sort of cocooned class of upper judiciary to wind back some of these restrictions, it was never going to happen. It hasn't happened in Canada. It hasn't happened here in Australia. Now, in Australia, there is no Bill of Rights, but you're getting the exact same outcomes. What was interesting in Australia is that there was a challenge to the border closures, because if you look at the Australian Constitution, it's not at all clear that these states could stop other Australians from coming in.
Right. So for Canada, that would be interprovincial travel. That's what
interprovincial.
The
equivalent. And they just closed it to everything. And so they're little sort of hermit kingdoms making up Australia. Wow. And the federal government refused to go to our top court to challenge this. They didn't like the politics of taking on the, you know, if you have 6 little states all trying to keep their own people clean, that's sort of the imagery they give. The central government was afraid of the politics. So a billionaire took the case to the top court. And of course, the judges threw it out. And I don't blame the judges for that one. If your central government is unwilling to take on the state premiers, then, you know, why should the judges do it?
Right.
So it's been a disaster. The courts have looked weak. The worst offender, in my view, is the prime minister, because, you know, he has plenty of constitutional tools to take on these out of control premiers. Hasn't used any of them.
Right.
So it is unwinding today now, because one of the states, New South Wales, where Sydney is, they have a new premier, and he's just come out and said, we're going to live with this. Wow. And we're going to open up. Like, we can't leave the country as a citizen. You cannot leave Australia without applying to a bureaucrat. And they basically turn down almost everyone.
Like, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, doesn't matter?
Doesn't matter. Cannot leave.
Because we're on the precipice of this in Canada, where in a few weeks' time, Justin Trudeau said that you cannot basically leave through an airport. You can't use an airport if you don't have double vaccination. And of course, you know, legal groups are up in arms and saying, well, this will infringe upon our mobility rights. But in Australia, you actually can't. You have to apply to the government for a pass to leave.
As a citizen, yes. And they're turning down about 80% of outlets. So we got out last year. It was a little easier. Now it's harder. But
wow.
Yeah, it's like taking us back to 17th century Japan, where you're just a cocooned little island. Now, what Mr. Trudeau should look at is the data from Europe. Look at Sweden. Look at some of the other Scandinavian countries which have had very, very light lockdowns. We are going to have to learn to live with it.
Wow.
And you know, this attitude that we can suppress it is just bonkers.
Okay, knowing that you were at one point able to leave, it was easier and now not so much. I guess Canadians are going to want to know is Australia, what is going on in Australia right now, is that what the future for Canada has in store? Will we see something similar replicated here?
Well, I don't think so, because Canada got the disease sweeping through it early on. So, I mean, people are a little more realistic in Canada that the option of sort of eradicating COVID is just not on the table. And I think if you look at, say, Florida, the data from Florida, he refuses to lock down. He did it early on, but hasn't since. And I think as of yesterday, Florida has the second lowest number of cases.
Wow.
Because even better than vaccines is the protection
immunity
you get when people have had the disease.
Right.
Natural immunity is better. So old people should be vaccinated, but people in their 20s face really such a low risk unless they've got massive obesity. The old strategy used to be let it sweep through the young people. They'll get immunity, and it'll you'll get the herd immunity that way. Instead, we're trying to vaccinate everyone. And the vaccines work, but they don't work nearly as well as look at the Israeli data. One of the studies said you're 27 times more protected if you've actually had the disease. Now, the vaccines are giving us protection, but they're not as good as, and you can't let old people get the disease because they're going to die. So you have to do it some way. I just think we should bring in the guy from Sweden, the epidemiologist who's world class, and fire everyone else and let this guy run the thing, because he's got every call right in my view. Okay, well, we'll have to see what is in store for the future of Australia, and maybe one day you'll get out and join us here on set. But thank you so much, Professor James Allan. I appreciate it. Enjoy Southern Ontario.